Hello and welcome to another episode of the Game Dev London podcast. My name is Adam and you can refer to me as he, him. And today I am with your friend and mine, Stuart DeVille.
Hello.
Hi, Stuart. Hi.
Nice, simple.
How are you
doing?
doing?
What do you need?
How are you doing today?
I'm good.
You
I'm
good?
very good. Tired, but excited about life.
Yeah, that seems to be the film. I mean, that response seems a little bit random. Speaking of random, today we're going to be talking about randomness in video games. So we're particularly going to be looking at what it means to have something that is random. We're going to be talking about spawning random items, the difference between random content, procedural content, and sort of handcrafted or curated content, the games which those are involved in, and the compromise you have to make as a developer on which direction you go and the pros and cons of all of those. Have you had a bit of a random week, Stu?
I have actually. Yeah. I've had many random things go wrong, and I couldn't have planned any of it. In fact, the plans that I did have were ruined by very random things.
And this is a big part of randomness, is that it's uncontrollable and unknowable. Because the thing that I found with randomness is that a lot of people have a predilection on what randomness means. So, for example, if I said to you, Stu, I want you to give me 5 random numbers between 0 and 10. Give me 5 random numbers.
5, 2, 7, 1, and 9.
So 5, 2, 7, 1, and 9. Now that seems pretty random, so you just picked a bunch of numbers. But where it gets interesting is actually that is very, very not random. And the reason it's not random is because Stu has done things in there which make sense in his brain. It sounds like I'm just calling Stu out on being not very random. Damn it, Stu. Be more chaotic. But
to be fair, it's not random because I did have a thought pattern in my head. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Absolutely. And not only did you have a conscious thought pattern, you also had a subconscious thought pattern. Humans are real big fans of patterns. We like to see things. We are very careful to see patterns. It's why, if you look at buildings, brickwork, famous paintings, those kind of things, normally they lean themselves in certain patterns. And we're not big fans of things when they are out of place. Now, when it comes to randomness, obviously randomness suggests being out of place. And actually the out of placeness is the pattern that we're looking for, which is sort of a reverse way of thinking about it. But that makes sense when you think about Stuart's numbers. So you got 5, sort of in the middle. 2, he drops down, but that's quite low. Jumps back up to go let's go all the way the other end. Goes to 7. Again, that's very high. Jump back down to 1, and then up again to 9. So it feels pretty random and chaotic. But the thing is when you take it to something that doesn't have those predilections, that force of pattern. So a computer, what equals random to a computer is very different. For example, a random pattern to a computer might be 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That could be a random pattern. And the moment I say that, people think about it, they go, that's not random. Look at it. It's 5 ones in a row. It's like, yeah, but it's random. It could be anything. You don't know. You may have had it before where you're listening to your favorite playlist, for example, and you hear two songs by the same artist, one after the other, and and your brain goes, oh, hang on, is shuffle on? Let me go and double check and da-da-da. And normally it is. It's just that you're assuming that because it's on random, it can't be 2 things. There should not be patterns. And if you see a pattern, then you think that something is wrong. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, because a lot of people start putting in randomness into their games to bring a bit of chaos into it so that they don't have to think about the chaos. Because chaos is difficult for us to consider. As just demonstrated by Stu, when you have to think about, give me 5 random numbers, you have to go, okay, that one, but then and then you start adding those patterns in, well, maybe not that one, and go down to this, and da-da-da. And it takes a lot longer. And this is especially true for a game. If you imagine something like a field, and you're going to put some trees and some rocks and some other bits and pieces in there. If you had to do that by hand, you'd be going, I'm going to put a tree there, maybe one, not that close, maybe over here, maybe some rocks down here. And you really think through all the stages of where those things are going to have to be. And that can take you, depending on how well your pipelines are set up, it can still take a good hour. Whereas if you can press a randomly distribute button and click it, and it just throws a bunch of trees, and you go, that's okay, but let's try another one, and just hit random 10 times until you're happy with it, that's much easier. And to some extent fun to kind of watch it go, woohoo, and see lots of random patterns happen. But it's a lot easier, and that's the point. So a lot of people tend towards using randomness, but don't take into account the fact that randomness could also mean that all those trees and all those rocks and all those plants exist on exactly the same point or are all colliding with each other, because randomness works in some places, but in a lot of places, what you're really talking about is procedural generation, which is where we use randomness but contain it within a selection of rules. So, for example, if I said to go back to my original question, Stu, give me a random number.
Random number 25.
Exactly. Right, Stu just had all the numbers in all of existence because I just said a random number. He could have said -10. He could have said 2 billion. He could have said minus 100,791.5 if he felt like it. He didn't.
Yep.
And he went for 25, which is absolutely fine because I put 0 parameters on it. Now, the problem is that what if I had wanted something specific? Say, so let's try and condense it down to a grid, right? Let's imagine in your heads, if you will, a 3x3 grid. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you said, the first thing you want to do is go, let's put 2 random things on there. They could go anywhere on there. But say you're trying to keep people separate. Maybe it's a battle between 2 sides and you want to keep them on separate sides of the grid. So you put your first one down, okay, and now you go, right, the next one has to follow a new set of rules, which means it can only be at the opposite end. So if it was the first one was on 1, 2, 3, the next one can only be 7, 8, 9. If it was on 3, maybe it can only be 6. You start to think about, well, 7 in that case. You start to think about, okay, how do I start to play this around? So have you come across this? Have you come across examples of procedural generation in sort of the games that you've been working on, Stu?
Yeah, the first game I worked on was an endless runner, and the tiles that appeared, whether you could pass them or not, and what types of tile they were randomly generated, just so that the player always had some different calculations to make in their head.
Mm-hmm. What kind of rules did you put in place on those?
That is a very good question. I think we had, I think it was something like there had to be a certain number of passable tiles versus the number of impassable tiles, and we also had we then injected like trap tiles that you had to jump over or interact with in some way, and I think that became again another percentage of what would be, so that in front of you I think it was a row of 6 or 7, and out of that 6 or 7 there was a percentage for each thing that could be on that row, and some rows did end up just like blank based on that. So
and that's exactly it, is that this is where it gets complicated, because the more and more rules you put down, the more and more space there are for things to break those rules. Things like blank spaces, tiles that don't work, patterns. And this is where we get into the interesting area of what does randomness mean to a computer. So again, randomness is an idea of just sort of chaotically reaching into the void and picking out something that fits within the parameters that you've got. I asked you for a random number, he gives me a random number, except that number always has rules on it. And that is also true for a computer, it just doesn't seem like it. When it comes to computers, the randomness is not normally linked somehow intrinsically to time and a seed. And a seed is just basically instancing your randomness. So saying, I want a randomness of factor 1. I want a randomness of factor 2. It's not a multiply. It doesn't make it more or less random. It just basically changes how the randomness persists over time. So, for example, a randomness of seed 1, the pattern for numbers 1 to 10 might give you the numbers 2, 4, 20. No, it wouldn't, because 1 to 10. This is how bad I am at randomness. 2, 7, 9, 3, 5. But then if you started it with a 2 instead, it might have gone 1, 4, 8, 2, 3, for example. Same sort of random generator, different set of random numbers. This is really good for testing out variations of randomness, because you don't know what you're going to get when you use random generation. You could get something that works perfectly first time, or something that looks like a hot mess. And using seeds allows you to change it. You'll recognize the phrase seed if you've played Minecraft, for example. You can put in a seed at the beginning of Minecraft to create the world in which you exist in. And this is where it gets interesting, is that you will also find, if you look online, people talking about the best seeds, or oh, this seed gave me this, or this seed was really difficult. And people will play it because it allows you to use randomness to create a world or a space or a distribution of objects that is preset, because the randomness is preset. It's not actually truly random, because true randomness is incredibly difficult to do, because you're having to pluck something out of nowhere, and you can't pluck something out of nowhere. The best you can come up with is a preset pattern that's pretty chaotic and seemingly without form, and utilize that as though it was random numbers. This gets into a weird area of things like cryptography, because it becomes a real pain when you're starting to do things with banks and that kind of stuff, because they need to use random numbers to hide things from each other and protect your accounts and all this kind of stuff. And obviously, it's incredibly difficult. So if you ever looked into prime numbers, they get used a lot because of their unique factors. They get used a lot for things like cryptography, and you'll only see this by the big competitions where it's like, oh, you get a million, you will give you millions of pounds if you can find the next prime number. Like, if you were interested in that kind of stuff, we'll put it in the show notes and you can go and look it up. But the point is that randomness is difficult at the best of times. So you want to start looking at these kind of patterns and spawning of objects and looking at which ones work for you. So normally, for example, a typical example for me is something like an asteroid field. So we're working on a game at the minute, so me and Stu are working on a game where there is a whole bunch of random debris in space that you have to fly through. Now, I set it up so that there's a big cube in space, and I spawn a bunch of objects inside it randomly. But I control that randomness by a couple of things. For one, I see it. For two, I set parameters, like how many objects are going to be in that space. How far apart do I kind of want them to be? What's the size of the object, etc. And then when I create them all, I look at the pattern and I go, right, if all the objects are all spawning in the bottom left, that's not great and doesn't really work for me. So I change the seed. Try again. What is this new seed like? Okay, now they're kind of relatively evenly distributed at random points around the map. That I'm happy with. And then I go forward with that new pattern. And that's where we're starting to move into that space of that sort of, it's blurring the line between procedural generation and randomness. Procedural generation, for those who are sort of wondering, you said it a couple of times, what you're talking about here, is just the procedural act of creating things using randomness that is sort of curtailed by parameters. So essentially it's going, instead of just saying, give me a random X, give me a random Y, give me whatever, it's using, give me a random this within these ranges, within this expense, and then I'll use that number to then affect the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So instead of just, creating something that makes no sense and has no shape or form, it's just it's a mess of whatever randomness came up with, it creates it within a set of parameters. It would be a bit like trying to randomly generate a recipe, right? You could just randomly generate a recipe and have 10 onions, a kilogram of sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla essence, a banana, some molasses, some milk, some salt, and a carrot. And it would be the worst thing that you've ever eaten in your entire life, because there's no control. It doesn't take into account nuance. It doesn't take into account context. What works with the other things? Are we looking at only sweet, or are we only looking at savory? Are we looking for certain flavors? By adding these sort of parameters and starting to control the randomness, you can actually generate something that, it still might not work. It still might, you might generate something where the ratios are off and it doesn't make a cake. It makes a flat or a nothing. But you could find something new within that space, because you take on the rules of nature that you're aware of and then paint on top of them this kind of randomness that allows you to sort of explore the space without you having to worry about making decisions.